think that the concerns that the West has about China, particularly when my interest in China on the African continent, there are many in the United States, particularly many members of the African diaspora, some would call themselves Pan Africanists, who are a little leery of China's emerging development and role on the African continent in terms of whether or not it's an actual bilateral, mutually beneficial kind of relationship, or is China actually coming into the African continent as the new style colonial power with a kind of exploitative model of extraction that really threatens the sovereignty and the integrity of the nation states in Africa? Now, there are others, I've heard many Africans say that China provides a more humane option in terms of bilateral participation than the West traditionally does. I'd like to hear your thoughts more in terms of China's role in Africa, and if it's a mutually beneficial role, or are the threats of exploitation that some fear more reality than others would care to discuss?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that if I were in government or in some sort of policy position or public discourse position in Africa, I think that there's been such a long history of outsiders coming into Africa in pursuit of their own agendas, whether it was European imperialism in the 19th century or American sort of neo-colonialism since World War II. I'd be a little wary. I'd be a little anxious about what was going on, when some new force, some new players show up on the scene. But I think that if we look objectively at what China has been doing, and of course this isn't just in Africa. The things like the Belt and Road Initiative, extend to other parts of Asia, even to parts of Europe. And these are efforts, like many of the undertakings in Africa, that are designed to develop essentially global economic infrastructure, communications, transportation, productive activities, things like that. And these are things which I think China certainly talks about and wants to present as a matter of kind of mutually beneficial development. The idea that these are investments that are going to pay off in the long run, that are going to be useful for the people in these host countries, and that it's a developmental initiative. And I think that's not a completely unreasonable position. On the other hand, China isn't doing this as a sort of a charity. China isn't doing this just out of the goodness of its heart. These are initiatives which will certainly be in the long-term interest of China itself. Now, does that mean, does that mean that these are exploitive relationships? Does that construct these relationships as oppressive? I don't think that's necessarily that's the only way to read that. Certainly, when China goes into a country in Africa and helps to develop infrastructure, helps to build port facilities or roadways or railways or airports, I think that those are things that are certainly going to be of value and use to the local economy. China is also investing in extractive industries and in agriculture. There's no question about that. Does the development of that kind of economic activity, is that something that only benefits China? No. Is it something that only benefits the host country? No. These are things that China is doing as investments, as part of its own ongoing project to develop its own economy. But China it sees, it understands that happens in the modern world in the context of a global economy. So, it's a complex set of relationships. I think that one thing to look at, and perhaps give a little nuance to all that, is that right now, in this context of the COVID pandemic, China has been, on the one hand, forgiving debt, and on the other, rescheduling debt repayment in some instances, because a lot of these countries have been hard hit by the pandemic, and they're struggling and they're having a hard time with their domestic economies. And organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, that go in and they dictate to these countries when their schedules of repayment are, and then there's all these penalties that go along with that. That's not how China has been handling this. They've been trying to be sensitive. They've been trying to accommodate the needs and the concerns of these countries in this immediate sort of crisis context. Now, of course, you can turn around and argue, well, of course, they want to maintain these relationships so that they'll get paid back in the long run. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. They do want to get paid back in the long run. As I say, it's not a giveaway. It's not a charity program. It's a program of mutually beneficial development. Does it proceed completely frictionless? No, of course not. On the other hand, another way to look at it, and this reflects some of the complexity of these critiques, is that on the one hand, we're told that China is going in and being the new sort of neo-colonialist power. But it's also the case that China, one of the fundamental tenets of Chinese foreign policy since the 1950s, has been non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. And so what that means is that when China extends loans or engages in investment activity, infrastructure development activity with countries in Africa and other places, that they don't impose political conditions. They don't go in and say, the way that the IMF or the World Bank or the United States government does, they don't go in and say, you need to do this, you need to restructure your welfare society, your welfare payments, you need to reform, you need to have a balanced budget and you can't have any deficit financing. They don't do that kind of stuff because they don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. So on the one hand, they get criticized for going into these countries and investing in them and engaging in these developmental activities. But then they also get criticized for not imposing political conditions. And it seems to me that there's kind of a, damned if you do and damned if you don't approach by the West to these activities on China's part.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that generally is that, China is acting in its natural interest in a bilateral way with the African countries, but that in terms of the options, considering the past, dealing with the IMF, the World Bank, and the U.S., you are optimistic that it provides a better option for the African nations. At the same time, it may not be exploitative in the same way, but it still is acting within the interest of China while providing benefit to these nation states on the African continent that they may not have. Well, there have been criticisms by some about the way in which China penalizes the African countries for lack of loan repayment. For example, extracting resources, seizing assets, seizing banks, which are a few incidents that have happened as of late in terms of China's kind of response to the inability of African countries to pay back on their debt servicing as supported by China. My position is not to take a yes or no either or position. My position is to not necessarily paint China as, the savior of all of the third and developing world, going back to the notions of the Bandung Conference, or to pose China as the new red menace. What I'm saying is that I think that we should acknowledge, and I think you have done so, that these are definitely more complicated, nuanced relationships between both actors. My question to you is that, do you think that we should be, or those of us who are interested in kind of global South continuum that challenges the traditional hegemony of Western nations like the U.S. and like European, like the very colonial empires, that we should be vested in a cooperation between China, Africa, and the global South? Are we being naive in thinking that something like that is aspirational in the first place? Or should we traditionally feel that such cooperation won't bode well for those countries that are not exactly in the best negotiating power?
Well, I think that there's a couple of ways that countries in Africa and in other parts of the world can pursue their interests. One, of course, is through as you've mentioned, Pan African solidarity. Obviously, China is a huge country with the now perhaps the largest economy in the world. It's got a lot of there's a lot of momentum, a lot of force, in their economic activities, and it's better if countries, not just in Africa, as I say, but elsewhere as well, can show some solidarity, show some mutual support amongst themselves. But I think the bottom line has got to be, and this isn't something that gets resolved in a weekend review of something. But the question overall is going to be, how beneficial are these programs? How well do things work for the countries that are hosting them? And I think that, on the balance, most of the countries that are on the receiving end have derived significant benefits from this. As I say, China's not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. It's not a charity program, and of course they're going to be seeking their own best interests as well. But they have, they're certainly publicly committed to working with these local governments and local business concerns and things like that. And I think that we need to any of these projects, any of these initiatives going on with China, we need to be critical, we need to be observant, and we need to see how that plays out in the long run. But I don't think that we're seeing a situation in which African countries are finding themselves newly impoverished or newly exploited in anywhere near the ways that Europe or Americans have for a century and a half and more. I think that China's trying to build a system of mutually beneficial development, and to the extent to which that can be encouraged and that can be monitored, I think that that's a positive initiative overall.
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This is Revolution Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Pandora, Podbean, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, you can catch a new episode every Wednesday on the Zero Books YouTube channel. This is Revolution.